Dr. Brian Domitrovic is our guest this segment on The Price of Business. He's been a guest on the program before. He's a good friend. I consider him a good friend of myself, but really a great friend of The Price of Business, and I love his insight. He's a true supply-sider, chairman of the history department over at Sam Houston State University, and really grateful. You know, and I think Sam Houston, when people look at your credentials, look at where you're found, you know, if you're not on Forbes, you're over at Kudlow. You're not at Kudlow. You're on the cover of either with your own book title or as an endorsement to the works of others. I mean, you've got great reach. In fact, I think I just saw, I'm reading, what's it called? Power and Knowledge right now by George Gilder. I think you endorsed that book on the back, didn't you?
Yeah, I did blurb George's book, and he has a new great book out on monetary policy, too, Kevin. I mean, he's really thinking about the 21st century. I mean, this whole fiat dollar thing, Federal Reserve controls the economy, that's so 20th century. We're going to move to a great new world in the 21st century where money's decentralized and economic growth is better.
Yeah, I like that. You know, I think there's competition works everywhere, doesn't it? Why don't we have competitive currencies?
Money always used to be competitive. The classical definition of money from the old Austrian, the original Austrian Karl Menger, was money is that good which can be readily exchanged for any other good.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with governments or anything like that. We got to get back to that world. It gave us the Industrial Revolution. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. I love that. Okay. We could talk about that the entire time, but I'm not going to, because I want to instead talk about the fact that the Obama administration is boasting about the fact that the trade deficit is shrinking. You know, and Jack Kemp, a mutual friend of both of ours, Jack Kemp used to say that, you know what, trade deficits really don't matter. It's not like countries are being ripped off because they're importing more than they're exporting. And in fact, the biggest trade surplus in the history of the United States in the last 100 years was during the Great Depression. And why was that? Was because the United States couldn't afford to import more goods. And so talk a little bit about this mythology and even romanticism about trade deficits and surpluses.
Yeah, I haven't. I've never really been sure that I really like a trade surplus or even a declining trade deficit, because all markets have to clear. And if you're running a trade surplus, that means that you are exporting capital, investment capital, out of your country. And if you're running a trade deficit, you're importing investment capital into your country. That's what we saw in the 1980s.
Yes.
I mean, all things have to settle. So if the trade deficit's going down, that actually means that the international investing class is less interested in investing in the United States.
Yeah, and that's always been the case, which is why, again, the most robust trade surplus we ever had was during the Great Depression. We sure had we had a lot to show for those years, didn't we?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, that was a big surprise. The United States passes the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, and then all of a sudden it's impossible to import goods into the United States. It threw the economy into depression, as Jude Wanniski explained in his great book, The Way the World Works.
Yeah, one of my favorite books, actually, on the supply side phenomenon. And I think all of that, just as the Austrians would argue, that paved the way to World War II, didn't it?
Well, of course. What happened was that it broke the gold standard as well. There's no way that an international monetary system where money can flow wherever it wants to is going to work if trade flows aren't secure, if aren't free. And then Germany decided, okay, we'll just hive off and have our own national economy. So did Japan. Japan invaded Manchuria 10 days after Britain abandoned the gold standard. And they said, okay, if it's going to be everyone for themselves, we're going to be for ourselves, and we'll just acquire more territory. There's World War II.
Yeah, no question about it. No question about it. And that's an interesting, to me, I've always found that to be the thing that desperate people do when they can't find anything else good about the economy. Well, at least the trade deficit is shrinking.
Yeah, Jimmy Carter used to kind of try to brag about that back in the 80s, and then the trade deficit went up in the Reagan years. Now, Reagan had some bad ideas when he tried to impose import quotas on Japanese cars and that kind of stuff, but he overcame that bad advice from some of his advisors. Trade deficit went up in the United States in the 1980s, and that's when the stock market went up 15 times because, you got to pay for those goods by capital investments. So when the trade deficit goes up, that means that people are fascinated by the American economy.
Absolutely. They're captured by it. All of that money, for example, Japan, we were importing so much from Japan. Meanwhile, they they owned almost half of the state of Hawaii at one point. By the late 1980s, they owned almost half of the state of Hawaii. In fact, if they owned as much of Hawaii in 1941, gone, they never would have bombed Pearl Harbor.
I love that. You know, they bought Rockefeller Center in the 1980s, and you got to look at all that stuff. They bought Pebble Beach Golf Course, and you got to look at all that stuff and say, wow, these world-class investors are saying, I want to put my money in the United States. That's where the action is going to be in the future. That's a beautiful thing. That's what you want.
Yeah, no question about it. I want you to talk a little bit about an article that I saw by Ralph Benko about Rand Paul draws liberal fire as Celeste discovers his inner love of the Fed. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Ralph is a good friend of mine. Ralph was one of the organizers of our meeting with Janet Yellen back in February when we talked to her for an hour about conservative gold standard monetary principles. And, Ralph has talked a lot with Rand Paul. And, the chip off the old block there, Ron Paul is very interested in monetary reform, probably something along the lines of a gold standard or a de facto gold standard through something electronic in the 21st century. And that is the wave of the future. I mean, Rand Paul is the cutting edge.
Yeah, no question about it. I think I would assume he's interested in a more Austrian approach rather than a Steve Forbes approach.
Yeah, I mean, the Austrians are kind of a big tent. But I do know that Rand Paul, and, there are a number of other candidates like this, too. I'd point out Ted Cruz. I mean, their focus is on economic growth. They don't think there's a lot of bitter medicine to take. Some of the Austrians say there's been such an expansion of the money supply and monetary blowouts over the years that we have to have a long spell of recovery in which the economy does poorly. I think Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, some of the others say, and Robert Mundell, who I wrote a book about, Founders Plus Side Economics, say, no. You get back on the sound monetary policy, the results will be immediate and great.
Yeah, I believe that. Jack Kemp was always optimistic about that. He believed you could grow your way out of, including deficits. It's way better to take a growth approach to deficits than there is a draconian approach.
Yeah, and I'm going to say right now that Mort Kondracki and Fred Barnes, their great biography of Jack Kemp is going to come out this summer. It's going to be a fabulous read. I've read a good part of the book. He's the most significant congressman of the 20th century.
No
and
question.
We're going to learn his lessons. This great optimist in the stagflation era of the 1970s gave us the great post-1982 boom. And let's read that biography and do it again.
Can I get you for another segment?
Sure.
Okay, I'd like to talk about your conversation with Janet Yellen after this break, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great, Kevin.
All right, Brian Domitrovic, by the way, you can find him at briandomitrovic.com. You can also check him out over at Sam Houston State at shsu.edu. Look up the history department. You'll find him there. More for you after this on The Price of Business.